Good evening, everyone, and welcome to the virtual room of the Italian Cultural Institute in New York. My name is Paolo Barlera. I'm the interim director of the Institute, and it is my pleasure to introduce tonight's webinar for a conversation about the recently published book, Strongmen, Mussolini to the Present, by Ruth Ben-Ghiat. For the conversation, I'm very pleased to have with us two dear friends, the author of the book, Ruth Ben-Ghiat, and Federico Rampini, both joining us from New York. Let me thank Ruth and Federico for being with us tonight, and then I'll say just a few words of introduction before leaving the screen to them. Ruth Ben-Ghiat is professor of history and Italian studies at New York University. She is the recipient of prestigious fellowships, including the Guggenheim and the Fulbright. As an historian and cultural critic, she is an expert on fascism, authoritarianism, war, and propaganda. She writes frequently for the media on those topics and has provided podcast and on-camera political commentary for Sky News, Slate, Salon, KCRW, Democracy Now!, Al Jazeera, and others. For those who are interested in learning more about her, she has a website, ruthbenghiat.com. Federico Rampini is the US Bureau Chief for the Italian daily La Repubblica. He is mostly known as a journalist and reporter, but he is also a prolific writer. And I would like to mention his two most recent books, L'Oceano di Mezzo, un viaggio lungo 24.539 chilometri, in which he tells about his life and work across the globe, and La Seconda Guerra Fredda, lo scontro per il nuovo dominio globale, the Second Cold War, the fight for the new global domination. One last thing, we will have 10-15 minutes at the end of the conversation for questions from the audience, and you can use the chat box on your Zoom screen. So thank you again, Ruth and Federico, for being with us, and over to you. Thank you.
Thank you, Paolo. I'm very happy for this opportunity. Thank you to the Italian Cultural Institute. It's an honor for me to introduce Ruth's fascinating book. It's really a very important book, and I hope that the Italian translation will hit quickly the bookstores in Italy, because it's full of Italian history, and it's important to discuss it in that context too, because there are two Italians that make the list of the strongmen, Mussolini and Berlusconi, for different reasons, of course. So let me first say this. This book is not really a book of comparative politics. Ruth is too much a subtle intellectual and writer to draw simplistic comparisons between Mussolini, Berlusconi, Putin, Pinochet, and Trump. So I think that, first of all, I would ask Ruth to explain exactly what your book is and what it is about.
Mm-hmm. Thank you, Paolo, and thank you, Federico. I'm really honored to be here to talk about Strongman, which, as we will get into, is indeed a book with also of Italian history. And Italian's very important in the book. So I felt it was time to look back at 100 years of authoritarianism and to look at how it has changed. So the book is divided into three eras. You have the fascist era, with Mussolini starting the template, and many things he pioneered, others learned from, including Hitler. Then the age of military coups, and I have Gaddafi, who's most of them are right-wing authoritarians, but Gaddafi is in the book because of he connects to the Italian rulers. And then the new authoritarian age, which Berlusconi pioneers, and this goes in two directions. You have leaders who have a very authoritarian style of government, but they don't wreck democracy, like Berlusconi, and we have Trump. And then you have Putin and Erdogan and rulers who have gone farther in taking away rights and opposition. But the core of the book is these chapters about the tools of rule: corruption, propaganda, masculinity, violence, and the myth of national greatness. And each of these chapters goes over 100 years. So the idea is for the reader to be able to look, let's say, in the propaganda chapter and see what's changed. Like we have social media now, and Mussolini used newsreels, and what stayed the same. And this was very surprising to me, how many things also stayed the same, like the personality cult. The canons of the personality cult have not changed. And then I have a concluding section of resistance, which goes over 100 years, and how they fall, endings, which might be interesting to people in America now, because we are living through the transition out of Trump land, as I call it. So that's the structure of the book. And I very much wrote it as an American, in part seeking to understand what is the place of Trump in all of this. It's the first book to put Trump in historical context. But as Federico said, I'm not trying to call Trump a fascist. I'm not saying he is another Mussolini. I'm trying to be very much a historian, to look at each person in their own time, but yet see what has continued, what strategies have continued. So that's basically the overview.
Thank you. So, Ruth, to me, one of the most interesting aspects of your book is where you deal with the machismo culture. This, what you have called a toxic masculinity and sexism. Now, here I do have a perplexity and a question to you. This is obviously an ingredient in most authoritarian leaders, and especially the fascist Mussolini, Berlusconi too, Putin. I think that there are even pictures in your book, photographs of one of the most beautiful moments in a meeting between Putin and Berlusconi in Sardinia. And you see the macho image radiating from those two guys. But so fascism with Mussolini is definitely very macho. But at the same time, I was reading recently another book. It's not a competitor with yours. It's Trump's Democrats by two US political scientists. And it's very interesting to see how machismo was also part of an old style political class. Politicians, especially on the left, there was a lot of pre-Trumpian leaders, people who practiced cronism, machismo, but they were also able to care about their local community. And very often they came from immigrant communities like the Italian Americans or the Irish, who had kind of a code of honor where the leader of the community had to be a macho. So this is interesting, and it's not necessarily an ingredient of fascism.
Yeah, so what I wanted to, I read a lot of history, obviously, I did archival work, I read a lot of political science studies, I used data sets, but I found that masculinity was not always taken seriously. And so I wanted, and instead, I think it's extremely important, a tool of legitimation of authority, both in the leader's presentation to his own people, and as you mentioned, with the twins of Berlusconi and Putin, and Berlusconi and Gaddafi, and this is an important part of presentation with and relationships of foreign leaders. So, so I isolate this and show in the case of this kind of strongman rule, and I define the strongman as somebody who is definitely authoritarian style of leadership, who uses this masculinity as part of his appeal and part of his policies, again, foreign leaders as well as his own people. And it connects to things that are common in the history of democracy too. So think about JFK, who had, you know, his own version of a glamour and personality cult. And of course it connects to leaders on the left, Castro and others had this kind of swaggering machismo. But I wanted to show how it intersects with these other tools of rule. So for example, in the personality cult, the leader is a man who's a man of the people, uomo del popolo, right? But he also has to be a leader above all other men. He's special. And he's also the man who gets away with things that regular men cannot. And this is a part of his appeal. And this is very true with Berlusconi. It can be in a democracy, it can be in an old-fashioned dictatorship. But so I wanted to show how they can become an example for violence in the old school dictatorships. And so this is how I'm using the concept as not just the pictures that we see of Putin without his shirt. And he and Mussolini have many of the same pictures, wrestling wild animals, kissing animals, you know, showing their chests, which is interesting. The iconography is so much the same. But also in a more nefarious, a darker place in setting a tone of lawlessness, kind of macho lawlessness. So that's how it's a multifaceted concept in my book.
I would like to go back to the similarity between Berlusconi and Trump, because of course it's very interesting to our Italian audience. I guess there is among our audience. So the machismo, okay, personality cult, okay, conflict of interest, absolutely. The similarities are evident. But in the end, Berlusconi conceded defeat. The Italian democracy is alive. We may think that it's not in a splendid health, but it's alive. And yet, because the issues that Berlusconi raised were not properly addressed by the Italian left, someone else replaced Berlusconi. And we had Salvini,
yes,
who's a different kind of macho leader, but some of the ingredients are the same. So shouldn't we also have a special attention to the ability of those supermen, strongmen, to through intuit or just political flair, to understand that there are real issues to be addressed and that there are real weaknesses on the left. And so shouldn't we also pay a lot of attention to these issues that explain their success, at least partially? It's not just personality cult. I mean, it cannot be just brainwashing. There must be something more solid than that.
No, I agree. And this is part of taking them seriously. And in fact, I just published an op-ed for CNN that talks about Berlusconi. And when he was voted out in 2006, it's intended as lessons for America today also. The center-left, there were expectations of the center-left to pass a lot of anti-corruption measures and because when these figures come into power, and this was true of every era, though the outcomes are different, you know, Mussolini had dictatorship, they expose the weaknesses in the system. They expose the parts that you can take advantage of to knock at democracy, to weaken democracy. And this is what Berlusconi did very beautifully. by making the laws, the ad personam laws. There were so many of them. So when he was voted out, this was a chance, and there was expectation to, pass reforms, and this didn't happen. And so this op-ed was directed to Americans that maybe doesn't know this story, but it's too easy to just look at the surface aspects, when indeed these figures are important because they show certain attitudes, and they also meet a real need. And Berlusconi, he's very prominent in my book because he was so important. He came in at the end of the Cold War, and he intuited, as a good marketer, what the political market could hold. And so these men are always they will be what you need them to be at that moment in time. And so he realized that there was the comfort of enemies. And so even though Italian Communist Party, like all the Western Europe, had just collapsed, he made himself the savior against the left. He continued this. So maybe this doesn't, when I tell my students this, they said it doesn't make sense because we just had the end of the Cold War and the fall of communism, but it doesn't have to make sense. And the same with Trump in a funny way. He read his whole thing about the forgotten people and people who had been apolitical before, which is also a market that Berlusconi tapped into. And I will be your voice, I will protect you. So the book is designed to show these patterns and these recurrences. And it's striking with Berlusconi and Trump, although the ending is very different, right? And I turned in the book in the summer. So I didn't know, I had a feeling that Trump would not leave quietly, but I didn't know yet what would happen now. So of course there are limits to the analogy, let's say.
And we will go back to this transition and what will happen now. That's probably for the end of our conversation. But let me stay on the a similar topic to the one we you just addressed. As you rightly pointed out, you are not only a distinguished historian, university professor, and a distinguished writer. You are also frequently a talking head for an expert interviewed by CNN. You write op-eds for the Washington Post. So somehow you intersect my same line of business, the media. And I have a question that is pretty much related to the role of the media, the mainstream media, the progressive, liberal, so-called fake media by Donald Trump. So going back to Mussolini, first of all, in the 20s, a lot of Italians, even democratic, sincerely democratic Italians or liberals, misunderstood the dangers of fascism. Many of them, they under-evaluated, they misunderstood. They didn't really see it coming. But now, on the contrary, in the last 4 years, we have had a kind of an orchestra of the media that was raising a constant alarm on one side, sometimes even saying what you never say in your book, that is that Trump is potentially a fascist. But even more so, what impressed me is that for 4 years, progressive media, and I'm talking about the important ones, the ones that are our newspaper, daily newspapers or daily TV networks. They had a narrative where every 2 or 3 months there was a massive rejection of Trump by a vast majority of American citizens, be it for the Mueller report first, the impeachment, then the COVID, then the recession. So there always seems to be a reason why this president was on a verge of a massive rejection. And that's not what happened. And the votes say that the result on election day, he had preserved basically the same percentage of consensus as 4 years before. Not much. I mean, he's a minority president, but his basis was the same. And he even, in absolute terms, he even gained a few million votes. So why this such a misunderstanding of what was happening in America? We were never on the verge of that massive rejection that was depicted by mainstream media.
That's a great question. I think that American media was, like many Americans in any walk of life, they were not prepared for Donald Trump. They didn't have a frame of reference adequate to interpret him. And part of this is, you know, we're very different than Italy and so many other countries. We never had dictatorship. We didn't have foreign occupation. We did plenty of damage to democracy elsewhere, our government. But that's not how it wasn't lived at home in this way. So I think that the media underestimated, as you say, the same as has happened many times in history, that these men are underestimated and people think they can tame them, or this is in terms of elites who bring them in the government and think they're going to calm down, right? And then it doesn't work that way. And this has happened over and over. But the media, I think that they were going on the standards of democratic presidents with a small d, not realizing that Donald Trump was not playing that game. He was playing a completely different game. And he also had this personality cult. He had like an authoritarian leader-follower relationship that he worked really hard. That's been one of his main goals as president, is to keep this personality cult going and keep people loyal to him. So that, just like with Mussolini, and again, it's a very different context, but the psychological dynamic is quite the same, that you will, if you believe in him and you bond to him, you will believe anything he says, or you will find an explanation for why things are not as he might say, or you believe he's a victim. And this is a constant in strongmen. They paint themselves as the victims of, here it's the deep state, plots, I was going to say complotti, and this Berlusconi also did this with the witch hunts, caccia di streghe. So they managed to keep people tethered to them, and they are the anchors of their people. And this withstands everything. So one common thing people say is, well, how come, they used to say it with Berlusconi too, how come, you know, there's this new scandal, this new corruption? Why does nothing change people's minds? Why does nothing bring them down? And you had the same thing repeating with Trump, and the media was not prepared. They were too legalistic, you might say.
Mm-hmm. And now, as a follow-up, I see another danger that, you know, when you look at the geographic, but even more so, the socio-economic divide between Biden voters and Trump voters, the divide based on professional status and cultural, basically graduated or high, let's say college graduated people versus non-graduated. And also, if we look at the tremendous increase in votes from Hispanics, sometimes decisive in Florida or in some counties in Texas. And these, by the way, were not the usual suspects, the Cuban Americans. There were a lot of Mexican Americans in Texas that voted massively for Trump, and the more so if they were near to the border and near to the notorious wall. So now the temptation, at least on some part of the left and some part of the liberal media, is to say, okay, these people, lots of people, 70 million people voted for him. They are either racist or bigots or idiots. totally stupid who vote against their own interest. And this can feed into the narrative of an elite, a coastal elite that is very condescending. So we, the intellectuals based in New York City or in San Francisco, we know what their best interests are. They are too stupid and too ignorant to know. That's dangerous because he might be able to preserve that consensus in the coming years. Don't you think so?
It is. And the more we will get information about how people voted from this election, this never-ending election, the better we'll be able to see. One thing I read just yesterday, which was interesting, is that, and again, you wouldn't expect this, Trump gained in votes by Muslims. And so, you know, this is somebody who's been anti-Muslim the whole time. But according to this study, the Muslims who voted for him were Muslims who identified as white. So here we do, the race is a real thing. And wanting to separate, this is often with immigrants too, and I'm a child of immigrants, you want to separate yourself. You want to feel that you're part of the included. And one thing that Donald Trump has done very effectively that all of these leaders do is make people dream about this community of inclusion, right? The Make America Great Again. And that's very important because it's not just future-oriented, the utopia, but I have a chapter, that's why I added a chapter on the myth of national greatness. It's always making it great again. So these leaders, and Mussolini, again, he's so important for the template. So Mussolini was Mr. Modernity, right? His, you know, flying airplanes and building stadiums, but it was making it great again. So you had going back to the Roman Empire. And Erdogan does the same thing. He builds airports and he builds highways, but he's obsessed with the Ottoman Empire. So Trump manages to make this community of included. And so in this, people also say, well, how come so many women voted for him? He's such a misogynist, right? But white women who vote for him, or white identifying women, feel superior to non-white men because the community lets them feel superior in this way. So the racism is real and it's very, very important. But I do believe that if we're going to get through this and combat polarization, we have to have a different attitude toward those who voted for him, which does not mean saying they were okay for their racism and you know, moving on, but understanding, you know, why they voted. And there are a segment of Trump voters who are lost. They're just totally, they are indeed indoctrinated. But I think there are other voters who may not have loved Trump, but were told that Biden would bring socialist apocalypse. So I believe that when Biden gets into office and they see that there is in fact no socialist apocalypse coming, they may be persuadable to come back to the rule of law, to come back to democracy and other forms of community.
So what you just said about the understanding of at least a part of the Trump voters brings to my memory, let's go back to Mussolini. Among all the autocrats that you deal with in your book about Strongman, he was probably the longest serving autocrat. And he, if he had not chosen Germany as its ally in the Second World War, maybe he would have been longer than Francisco Franco in Spain. When I was a young student in college, I was a member of the Italian Communist Party. So we studied a lot the history of fascism. And one of the compulsory readings was by Palmiro Togliatti, the communist leader during fascism and afterwards. He became a minister in the first after-war government. Togliatti wrote Lessons on Fascism, which was a very a very strong and severe self-criticism of the radical left. So it was first and foremost a reflection on all the mistakes that in the 20s the radical left had made in Italy, especially the Biennio Rosso, 1921, strikes everywhere, violence in the streets, also by left radicals. So is there any effort today in the United States to attain that level of self-criticism?
By the way, I assigned the Togliatti Lessons of Fascism this semester in my fascism class. And one of the points that is, I think has gotten through is one of the biggest mistakes that the communists made in the 1920s and then again in the 30s, and Trotsky was trying to warn, is not unifying together. And so they branded as social fascists, this was the term, even social democrats or socialists, anybody who wasn't one of them. And this was a mistake. You couldn't fight the right if you were not united. So, I mean, it's too much of a stretch to go from that to contemporary America, but I think that what I'd like to point out is the similarity of the strongman rhetoric trying to create polarization, because unity always is stronger and a divided country is easier to control by a demagogue. So it's been very notable to me, and it echoes things said by Mussolini, by Franco, by Pinochet, on and on, the Trump administration's whole discourse about the radical left, because what they want to do is take away the center and scare people, these are scare tactics, into thinking there is no center, and that liberals, even Nancy Pelosi, who wears Chanel jackets and pearls, becomes radical left. I've been accused, including in the Wall Street Journal, of being a radical left, a Marxist, which I'm not. I'm a liberal. But it's a rhetorical ploy of very bad faith to try and make people have this politics of apocalypse. So that's been very notable, to go 100 years through our mostly right-wing history and see that this occurs over and over again. And the few voices on the left that tried to that tried to talk for unity against the right. So I'll leave that there.
So my last question will be, of course, on the transition. And as you rightly explain in your book, Strongman, which I again recommend all our audience to buy and read, usually autocrats, or at least many of the autocrats that you analyze, get to power via elections, and then they manage to stay. But not every would-be dictator can become a real one. So until now, Trump, after election day, is pretty much following the playbook, the authoritarian playbook. He is denying a result which is obvious, which has been certified by many local authorities, state governments. What's going to happen from now till January 20, and then afterwards? What's the second act of Donald Trump?
Yeah, I want to emphasize how unusual and unprecedented this is, where the minute that Biden won and the GOP and Trump would not accept the election, a kind of window opened up of this, a form of a state of exception, or a very twilight zone, a very strange time. And there are all kinds of strange behaviors. But what's very scary is that Donald Trump, like many autocrats, he needs to stay in power for many reasons, but one of them is to avoid prosecution. This is the it's always been the case. Mussolini partly declared dictatorship, as you well know. He was the prime minister of a democracy, and he declared dictatorship in part to escape a prosecution for the Matteotti affair. This is an old playbook. So he's been trying and failing at the electoral manipulation, but he also was exploring military option, which is why the chairman of the Joint Chiefs of Staff, General Millet, came out, and said, oh, the armed forces will not obey an individual, only the Constitution. So all of this is very frightening. And now you hear much more violent rhetoric. And the one thing some people are scared about is he will try and energize these militias and try and keep a sense of instability and chaos. Many outcomes could happen. But once he leaves, he will take his personality cult with him. He got more votes, as you pointed out, than he did in 2016, despite the pandemic and economic collapse for some people. And he's not going to give up these 70 million souls that he spent so much time to conquer. And so one solution is what I believe we will hear soon, is that he's declaring a run for office in 2024, because then he can function as a kind of shadow president for his America, because he's never wanted to be the president of every American, just his Americans. So I think this is what we'll see. And then he can continue his rallies. And of course, he doesn't care if there's a pandemic. He just has rallies anyway. And he can continue his whole persona and try and continue to delegitimize the liberals and Biden.
Well, thank you very much, Ruth. It's been a pleasure. I know that you have a TV appointment with CNN, I guess, in a few minutes, but we might have some more time if there are questions that Paolo wants to.
Yes, let me come in again and remind the audience that they can ask questions with the chat function. And I have a long questions that Mr. Mel Berkowitz wrote to me by email, and I will try to extrapolate the actual questions which are about Italian history. He writes, I attended a screening of the film Vincere in 2009. Mussolini had been a journalist and a socialist in his early career. I think he was an opportunist. He was not a strong leader. And then I will jump ahead. Mr. Berkowitz touches upon all kinds of salient events in Italian history. And we jump to Berlusconi. Where is Berlusconi now? Could he prevent the pandemic? Who would you consider a strong leader in the Italian government? So which questions you want to answer, maybe all of them or just?
I do want to say, given this is the Istituto Italiano di Cultura, that one of the things I wanted to do with this book is really show how important Italian history is and how important Italian leaders have been. Maybe it's not to a very positive thing, unless you like authoritarianism. I personally do not. I think it's destructive. But Mussolini is way more important, and many of you will know this, than he gets credit for, because Hitler, our minds go to Hitler for very good reasons, but Mussolini is the pioneer of the template that is still used in many cases. Media policy, personality cults, corruption. We're still getting a lot of new research on his corruption. And Hitler indeed adored him. Hitler was so obsessed with Mussolini that he had a bust of Mussolini in the 1920s, because he couldn't get to power, on his desk. And other Nazis thought this was like embarrassing that he loved Mussolini so much. So, and then Berlusconi is equally important, because he traces out this template for authoritarian style rule in a nominal democracy. And he mainstreams the far right. He's the first person to bring what used to be neo-fascists into the government. And so I wanted to integrate, often Italian history doesn't get enough coverage. And I wanted to integrate it and show how important it is to this kind of global system of rule. So that's, just to answer quickly, yes, Mussolini was an opportunist. All of these men are opportunists. The reason they have success is, and they end up with these very strange constituencies, these partnerships with all kinds of people, is because they don't have many fixed principles. They will ally with anyone in order to get what they need. So we have these strange repetitions in history that the most unpious, profane individuals are the ones who do very good deals with religious institutions. So think of Mussolini, who was a total atheist, very anti-clerical, and the one who did the Lateran Accords. And then 100 years later, Trump is the last person in think about his life that one would think would be acclaimed by Orthodox Jews and evangelicals as, they lay the hands on him. He's acclaimed as there by the will of God to save America. But he recognized that this would be a good alliance for him. So their opportunism allows them to be very successful. We'll stop there.
Okay, thank you. I don't think there are other questions from the audience, but I would like to close with a question from myself. I was watching a few days ago the TV series The Crown, where we see Margaret Thatcher, among other characters. So the question is, are there or have there been strong women in politics or history? In a more general sense, of course.
Yeah. So, of course, there have been many female tyrants in history, and I could have put, since I do have figures like Berlusconi who don't ruin democracy altogether, I could have put Indira Gandhi, other people who had illiberal sides to them, or Margaret Thatcher, the Iron Lady. But I have plenty of female perpetrators in the book, torturers and propagandists. So it's certainly not a discourse of the men are bad and the women are good in my book. But I wanted to isolate this virility and how it works with corruption and the other tools, because I do believe that in the future we will have an authoritarian female leader. There are many women who are prominent in the far right today in Europe. And I don't know if somebody like Giorgia Meloni will ever get to the head of state, but there are people, and of course Le Pen in France, and Ivanka Trump is being marketed for years by her father as a world leader, to the point where she was inserted into the G20. I was horrified when I saw this, that she was put in the center too, not even on the edge of the photo in 2019 of the G20, as though she were already a female leader. So we may have that, and in that case, the virility part will be a bit different. Ivanka would not be stripping her shirt off like Mussolini and Putin, but a lot of the other things would stay the same, the corruption, the racism. But so I feel that this configuration of power with the cult of the male power and force isn't going to be around forever, and a lot of these men are not young. So they're getting to be a certain age. So I wanted to kind of analyze this as it exists now, because I feel that one day it will not be all like this.
Thank you. So I think we can wrap it up at this point and leave you to TV and other interviews. Thank you, Federico, for your insightful questions, and I hope you.
My pleasure.
I hope our viewers will continue to follow us in the next few months and weeks. Unfortunately, we'll have to be online for a few more months, and so this is again the virtual room of the Italian Cultural Institute. Thank you for watching us, and good night, everybody.
Thank you so much to both of you. Thank you, everyone who tuned in.